Grace Thompson has spent decades keeping her suburban neighborhood in perfect order. But when a young couple moves in and hosts a wedding that disrupts her idea of tradition, Grace's world spirals out of control. What starts as a bitter confrontation leads to the resurfacing of a dark Secreta Hitandran accident she's kept buried for years. As her community moves on without her, Grace must face her guilt and question if redemption is possible, even after a lifetime of pushing others away. Curious to see how it all unfolds? Subscribe and hit the notification bell for more. What would you do if your past came back to haunt you? Comment below with your thoughts. Grace Thompson stood by the window of her living room, watching the street in front of her house like she had every day for the past 30 years. Her hands rested on the windowsill, the wood worn down in the exact spot where her fingers had gripped it for years. Chestnut Grove, her suburban haven, looked as orderly as always. The lawns were neatly trimmed, the hedges impeccably shaped, and the houses, small but dignified, stood in neat rows. Yet something was changing, and Grace couldn't quite put her finger on it. A moving truck appeared from around the corner, its loud, rumbling engine disturbing the peaceful hum of the quiet afternoon. Grace's eyes narrowed as she tracked its slow approach, stopping 2 doors down from her own home. Another new family, she thought with a sigh, another group who didn't understand the delicate balance of this neighborhood. In her mind, Chestnut Grove was a place where traditions were respected, where order was prized, and where newcomers learned to fit in or found their way out. She had lived here for 4 decades and considered herself the unofficial guardian of that balance. Grace's late husband, Richard, had often told her that she was too intense about these things. "Let it go," he would say in his gentle voice. But that wasn't Grace's way. After Richard passed 3 years ago, a quiet heart attack while he was out trimming the hedge, Grace had clung even tighter to the neighborhood's customs. It was what kept her steady, gave her a sense of control when the rest of the world felt like it was spiraling into chaos. She turned away from the window, pushing the uneasy feeling from her mind. The house felt larger than it used to, emptier too. Without Richard, without her son Matthew, who had moved to the city and barely called anymore, the house was just space. And so Grace cleaned, rearranged, organized, and monitored the street outside. It was the only thing that kept the loneliness at bay. As she moved toward the kitchen, she passed by the hallway mirror, catching her own reflection. Her hair, once a rich chestnut brown, was now streaked with gray, pulled back in a tight bun. Her face, though still sharp, had softened with age, but the frown lines around her mouth and forehead were deeper now than she remembered. Grace didn't like seeing herself this way. It made her feel old and irrelevant in a world that seemed to care less and less about people like her. With a glance back out the window at the new family moving in, she pursed her lips. Things were changing, and Grace wasn't sure she liked it. 2 days later, Grace was back at her usual post by the window when she saw the new neighbors, Alex and Brooke Johnson, emerge from their house. The couple stood on the lawn, examining a piece of paper, talking quietly to each other. Alex, a tall man with dark skin and a confident demeanor, wore jeans and a simple polo shirt. Brooke, with her warm smile and short curly hair, seemed more casual, carrying a box of decorations to the car. Grace watched them for a moment, her mind racing. She had already heard some of the whispers around the neighborhood. They were different, new blood from the city, people who didn't understand how things were supposed to work here in Chestnut Grove. She couldn't hear their conversation, but when Brooke's laughter drifted up to her window, it rubbed Grace the wrong way. Too loud, too careless. A flash of blue caught her attention on the paper in Alex's hand. As they turned toward their car, Grace saw a banner hanging from their porch, "Save the Date Johnson Wedding Celebration." Her stomach twisted. They were planning a wedding here, in the neighborhood park. Grace's chest tightened. This park, the same one where Richard had proposed to her, where they'd watched their son play as a boy, wasn't just any space. It held memories, a sense of quiet sanctity that was sacred to the residents. At least that's how Grace saw it. In the next second, she was pulling open her front door and striding across the street. As she approached them, the couple looked up, surprised by her sudden appearance. Grace put on her best neighborly smile, but there was tension in her voice. "Hello there, I'm Grace Thompson. I live just across the street," she said, gesturing toward her house. "I couldn't help but notice your banner. You're planning a wedding celebration in the park." Brooke smiled, offering a hand. "Yes, we're having a small reception there. My family's been here for years. This neighborhood has a lot of memories for us." Grace didn't shake her hand. "The park, it's a special place. There are rules. It's not meant for big events." "Did you get permission from the neighborhood association?" Alex's smile faltered slightly. "We coordinated everything with the city. It's all set up, fully permitted." Grace's lips tightened. "Well, I suppose I'll have to check with the association. It's just, we like to keep things peaceful around here. I hope you'll keep that in mind." Brooke's smile didn't waver, but there was a firmness in her eyes. "Of course. Well, be respectful, Mrs. Thompson." Grace nodded, but as she walked back to her house, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to go wrong. The park wasn't meant for this. It wasn't meant for them. She had to protect what was left of Chestnut Grove, for Richard Sakino matter the cost. The following week, Grace attended the neighborhood association meeting, as she did every month. It was a small group of longtime residents, each as invested in keeping things right as she was. As she sat among them in the church hall, she waited for the moment to bring up the Johnsons' wedding. But to her surprise, no one mentioned it. She glanced around the table at the familiar faces, feeling a knot tighten in her stomach. "Has anyone heard about the event planned at the park next weekend?" Grace asked, her voice a little too sharp. The group looked up, a few murmurs passing between them. "Oh, yes," said Janet, the association's president, "the Johnson family's celebration. They filed the proper permits with the city. It's all taken care of." Grace's eyes narrowed. "But don't we have a say? The park is supposed to be a peaceful space, not a place for loud parties. I don't remember voting on this." Janet sighed, her eyes softening in that way that Grace had come to despise over the years, a look of pity. "We've had events there before, Grace. As long as they follow the rules, there's no harm in it." "No harm!" Grace's voice rose, drawing more attention. "This is our neighborhood. We've kept it the way it is for a reason. If we let people come in and start using it however they like, we lose what makes Chestnut Grove special." The room fell silent, and Janet spoke gently but firmly. "We all have to adapt, Grace. The community is changing. New families are moving in. It's just how things are." Grace felt a burning in her chest. They didn't understand. Or worse, they didn't care. The meeting moved on, but Grace's mind was stuck on the Johnsons and their wedding. Something had to be done. If no one else would take action, she would. By the time the wedding day arrived, Grace had convinced herself that the Johnsons were a threat to everything she held dear. It wasn't just about the park anymore. It was about the neighborhood itself. If people like the Johnsons could come in, hold their loud celebrations, and change the fabric of Chestnut Grove, what would come next? Standing in front of her window, Grace watched as the preparations began in the park. Brooke's family was setting up chairs, hanging floral arrangements, and chatting happily as they worked together. Grace's stomach churned as she watched. It all felt wrong, disruptive. Without thinking, Grace grabbed her purse and keys from the table and marched out the front door. The hot summer air hit her as she strode across the street toward the park, her heels sinking slightly into the grass as she approached the group of wedding planners. The laughter and music grated on her nerves, and she clenched her fists as she stepped into the middle of the gathering. A silence fell as people turned to look at her, confusion flickering across their faces. Grace's heart pounded in her chest. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice harsher than intended. "Who gave you permission to take over the park like this?" The atmosphere in the park, once filled with joy and excitement, shifted in an instant. As Grace's sharp words cut through the air, all eyes turned to her, standing rigidly in the middle of the gathering. The breeze carried the scent of fresh flowers from the bouquets that had been carefully arranged for the ceremony. But to Grace, it all smelled wrong, like something foreign in her pristine world. Brooke was the first to approach, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. "Mrs. Thompson, is there something wrong?" she asked, her voice calm and even. Grace's gaze flicked to the banner strung across the gazebo Johnson wedding celebration. It taunted her, reminding her of how little control she had left. Her lips curled into a frown. "You didn't get permission from the neighborhood association for this event," Grace snapped. "This is a public park, and we don't allow this kind of thing here. It's disruptive." Brooks' family, gathered around the chairs, exchanged uneasy glances. A few people in the crowd reached for their phones, sensing that something unpleasant was about to unfold. Alex, standing beside Brooke, stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "We've been through this already, Mrs. Thompson. Everything is cleared with the city. We're following the rules." But Grace was too far gone to listen. Her heart pounded in her chest, and all the frustrations of the past months boiled to the surface. "This isn't just about permits," she hissed, her voice trembling with anger. "It's about respecting this neighborhood. This park isn't for parties. It's for people who live here and understand what it means to be part of this community." Not for she stopped herself, but the words hung heavy in the air. "Not for people like you." Brooke's eyes widened, but her voice remained calm. "We do live here. We're part of this community just like you are." Grace's hands trembled. The words that had been burning in her chest for so long now spilled out uncontrollably. "People like you come in and change everything. You don't care about the traditions here, the way we've built this place. You just want to come in and do whatever you want, and it's not right." The tension in the air grew thicker. Alex's jaw clenched, but he remained composed. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm sorry you feel that way, but we aren't doing anything wrong. We're celebrating our wedding in the park just like anyone else would." "Not like anyone else," Grace shot back, her voice rising. "You don't belong here." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Grace realized too late that her words had landed exactly as she had feared. Phones were out, recording everything. Grace felt a flicker of doubt, but her anger overwhelmed it. She was in too deep now to back down. Brooke's voice cut through the growing whispers, calm but filled with steel. "Mrs. Thompson, I think it's time for you to leave. We're not breaking any rules, and we're not going to let you ruin our day." Grace stared at her, feeling the weight of all the eyes on her. She had always prided herself on being the one in control, the one who kept everything in order. But in this moment, she felt that control slipping through her fingers like sand. Before she could say another word, the sound of sirens broke through the tension. The police had arrived. Grace's heart raced as she saw the police car pull up beside the park. Her pulse pounded in her ears, and for a moment she wondered if she had gone too far. But a part of her still clung to the belief that she was in the right, that the police would understand and put an end to this madness. 2 officers stepped out of the car, their expressions neutral as they approached the crowd. One of them, a tall man with graying hair, spoke first. "What seems to be the issue here?" Grace was quick to step forward, trying to steady her voice. "Officer, thank goodness you're here. These people are holding a wedding celebration in the park without proper authorization. It's disturbing the peace, and they didn't get permission from the neighborhood association." The officer glanced around at the guests, the neatly arranged chairs, the flowers, and the decorations. He looked back at Grace, his brow furrowing. "Do they have permits for the event?" Alex stepped up, producing a folder from his jacket pocket. "Yes, officer. We coordinated with the city. All the permits are here." The officer took the papers and examined them. After a few moments, he nodded. "Everything seems to be in order here. They followed the proper procedures." Grace felt her stomach drop. "But this isn't how things are done here. This is a quiet neighborhood. We have rules, traditions." The officer's tone softened, but there was a firmness to his words. "Mom, they're not breaking any laws. This is a public park, and as long as they followed the city's regulations, they have the right to hold their event." Grace's face flushed with heat. She could feel the stares of the wedding guests boring into her, and for the first time, doubt crept in. But she wasn't ready to give up. "You don't understand. This isn't just about the permits. It's about keeping the neighborhood the way it's supposed to be." The officer glanced at the crowd, then back at Grace. His voice remained calm but firm. "Mom, I think it's best if you let these folks enjoy their day. There's no need to escalate things further." Grace's throat tightened. She wanted to scream, to make them all understand what was at stake. But as she looked around, she saw the phone still recording, the disapproving faces of her neighbors, and the weary expressions of the officers. She was outnumbered, out of control. Without another word, Grace turned on her heel and marched away, her head held high even though her insides churned with humiliation. As she crossed the street back to her house, the wedding guests erupted in quiet murmurs behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know that her outburst was already spreading online. By the time she closed the door behind her, the damage was done. Grace sat at her kitchen table staring at the blank screen of her phone. It had been less than an hour since she had stormed away from the park, but the fallout had already begun. Her phone buzzed incessantly with messages, notifications, and missed call, each one a reminder of how badly the day had gone. She had hoped that once she got home, she would feel better, that the anger would settle, and she could convince herself she had done the right thing. But the pit in her stomach only grew heavier as the minutes passed. With a trembling hand, Grace unlocked her phone and opened her messages. The first few were from neighbors, people she had known for years. "Grace, what were you thinking? That was out of line. You've gone too far this time." She scrolled through the messages, her pulse quickening with each new notification. Then she opened her social media feed. The first thing she saw was her video, the one from the park. The caption read, "Local woman disrupts wedding with racist rant." Her breath caught in her throat as she pressed play. There she was, standing in the middle of the park, shouting at Alex and Brooke, her face twisted with anger. The comments poured in below the video, each one more brutal than the last. "Unbelievable. This is 2024, not 1960. I hope they kicked her out of the neighborhood. Someone needs to check their racist grandma." Grace's hands shook as she read the words, each one feeling like a punch to the gut. She had known people would be upset, but she hadn't expected this, a flood of hatred and condemnation from strangers all over the internet. Her name was trending now, attached to a hashtag that made her stomach churn, "Wedding Wrecker." She dropped the phone onto the table, burying her face in her hands. The walls of her once orderly life were closing in on her, and for the first time in years, Grace felt truly lost. The days following Grace's public meltdown were a blur of silence, shame, and regret. She had always believed herself to be in control of her surroundings, but now her life felt like it was spinning out of control. The neighborhood no longer greeted her with polite smiles. Instead, they avoided her entirely. The isolation that had once been her choice now became a prison of its own. Grace couldn't stop replaying the events in the park. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the Johnsons, the guests, and the police. But more than that, something deeper was gnawing at her. The confrontation had triggered something long buried, the guilt she had been suppressing for years. The hitandron. It had been nearly a decade ago, on a day that had started like any other. Grace had been driving through the neighborhood, her thoughts preoccupied with one of her many errands. That's when it happened. A child had darted out from between two parked cars. She remembered the screech of tires, the heart-stopping moment of impact, and the panicked decision to keep driving. Her hands had trembled on the steering wheel for hours afterward, but she had convinced herself it was her fault. For years, she had buried the memory, locking it away in the same mental drawer where she kept all of her unresolved guilt. She had managed to convince herself that no one had seen, that no one would ever know. But now, in the aftermath of the viral video and the relentless public scrutiny, that old guilt had resurfaced like a dark shadow she couldn't shake. It was late one evening when she found herself sitting alone in her living room, staring at the family photos on the mantelpiece. Richard's face smiled down at her from their wedding portrait, an echo of the man who had always been patient and kind, even when Grace had pushed him too far. Her eyes lingered on his image as her thoughts turned inward. She had spent so much time controlling the world around her, maintaining the illusion of perfection in the neighborhood, in her family, in herself. But it had all been a lie. Hadn't it? Richard had never truly been happy, and neither had she. Now, as the weight of the past bore down on her, Grace couldn't hide from the truth any longer. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock on the door. Grace's heart jumped in her chest. No one had visited her in days. Who could it be? She hesitated before crossing the room and pulling open the door. Standing on the front porch was a man she didn't recognize at first. He was tall, his face serious but calm, with a deep sadness in his eyes. It wasn't until he spoke that recognition struck her like a blow. "Mrs. Thompson." His voice was quiet, but the weight of his words was heavy. "My name is Jacob Anderson. We need to talk." Grace's mouth went dry as she stared at the man in front of her. Jacob Anderson. The name alone sent a wave of nausea through her. She remembered that name from the news articles, from the whispers in the neighborhood. Jacob had been the boy she had hit with her car all those years ago. For a moment, Grace was frozen, unable to process the fact that Jacob now stood before her as a grown man. She had tried so hard to forget, but there was no forgetting now. He was here and he knew. "I know what you did," Jacob said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of years of pain. "I know you hit me with your car, and I know you drove away." Grace's knees felt weak, but she gripped the doorframe to steady herself. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, the denial slipping from her lips automatically. "It was an accident. I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean to leave me there," Jacob interrupted, his eyes hardening. "I was just a kid. I lay there on the street, waiting for someone to help. But you drove off." The truth was undeniable now. Grace could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, suffocating her. The excuses she had told herself for years, "It wasn't my fault. I didn't know what to do," sounded hollow even to her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jacob took a deep breath, his expression unreadable. "Sorry doesn't change what happened. I've lived with the consequences of that day for years. I was in the hospital for months. My family didn't know who hit me or why no one stopped to help. You didn't just break my bones, Mrs. Thompson. You broke my trust in people." Grace's breath caught in her throat. She had never thought about the long-term impact of what she had done. She had been so focused on preserving her own sense of righteousness that she had never considered what her actions had done to Jacob and to his family. Grace began, but her words faltered. What could she say to make this right? Nothing. She knew that now. There was nothing that could undo the damage. Jacob's face softened, though the sadness in his eyes remained. "I'm not here for an apology. What's done is done. But I wanted you to know that I remember. And you'll have to answer for what you did." Grace's stomach twisted. "Answer? I've spoken to a lawyer," Jacob said. "We're reopening the case. The statute of limitations hasn't expired. You're going to be charged with fleeing the scene of an accident." The blood drained from Grace's face. "But it was so long ago." Jacob's gaze hardened again. "It may have been long ago for you, but I've lived with it every day since. The pain, the therapy, the questions. It's time for you to face what you've done." With that, Jacob turned and walked away, leaving Grace standing in the doorway, trembling. The full weight of her guilt crashed down on her, and for the first time in her life, she felt completely powerless. Grace didn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jacob's face, filled with quiet anger, and heard his words echoing in her mind. "You're going to be charged." She had spent her life policing the neighborhood, enforcing rules, and upholding standards. She had believed herself to be above reproach, a moral compass for the people around her. But now the roles had reversed. She was the one in trouble. She was the one who had broken the rules, the law. The knock on the door came early the next morning. Grace had been expecting it, but the sound still sent a jolt of fear through her. She stood in the middle of the living room, her heart pounding as two police officers stepped into the house. "Mrs. Grace Thompson," the taller of the two officers asked, his tone firm but not unkind. Grace swallowed hard. "Yes, that's me. We're here to arrest you in connection with a hit-and-run accident that occurred several years ago," the officer said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "You're being charged with leaving the scene of an accident involving injury." Grace's hands shook as the officer stepped forward. "Do you understand the charges against you?" She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She didn't resist as the cold metal of the handcuffs clamped around her wrists. The officers led her out of the house, her neighbors watching silently from behind their windows. As she was escorted to the police car, Grace felt the full weight of her life collapsing around her. The shame, the guilt, the loneliness, they all pressed down on her, suffocating her. The woman who had spent her life controlling others was now at the mercy of forces beyond her control. The drive to the police station was a blur. Grace's mind raced with thoughts of Richard, of Jacob, of the wedding she had tried to destroy. How had it come to this? How had her life spiraled so completely out of control? But deep down, she knew. It had all started with her own choices she had made long ago. Choices she had refused to face until now. The courtroom was packed. The media had picked up on the story quickly, especially after the viral video of Grace's outburst at the Johnsons' wedding had resurfaced in the wake of her arrest. Now her face was plastered across screens and headlines, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in her life. Grace sat at the defendant's table, her hands trembling as the trial began. The prosecution presented their case with precision and clarity, painting a picture of a woman who had fled the scene of a crime, leaving a young boy broken and alone on the street. Jacob, now a man, sat in the front row, his presence a constant reminder of the damage she had caused. The defense tried to argue that Grace had panicked, that it had been a moment of fear and confusion, but even Grace knew that wouldn't be enough. She had spent too many years running from the truth. Jacob took the stand. His testimony was calm, measured, but filled with the pain of years spent wondering why no one had helped him. I lay there, waiting for someone to come back. I thought maybe they didn't realize what had happened. But no one came. Grace closed her eyes, her heart heavy with regret. There was no escaping the truth now. She had left him there. She had driven away. The courtroom felt oppressively silent as the jury filed back into their seats. Grace's hands were clenched tightly in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. She could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her, as if everyone's eyes were on her, judging her not just for what had happened that day, but for the years of her life that had led to this moment. Her lawyer had done everything he could, but Grace knew it wasn't enough. It had never been enough. The judge's voice rang out in the silence. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" A middle-aged man stood holding a folded piece of paper. He glanced briefly at Grace, then back at the judge, his face unreadable. "We have, Your Honor." The paper was handed over, and the judge unfolded it slowly, reading the words to herself before looking up at the room. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Grace Thompson, guilty of leaving the scene of an accident involving injury." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. Her heart pounded in her chest, and the air in the room seemed to thicken, making it hard for her to breathe. Guilty! She had known it was coming, had known for years that this moment would arrive if the truth ever came out. But that didn't make the reality any easier to bear. There was a collective murmur from the gallery as people shifted in their seats, some shaking their heads, others nodding solemnly. The sound of the gavel brought the room to silence once more. "Mrs. Thompson, you are hereby sentenced to 5 years in state prison," the judge announced, her voice even and measured. "You will be eligible for parole after serving 3 years, depending on good behavior. Court is adjourned." The gavel struck again, but the sound barely registered in Grace's mind. Everything seemed distant, muffled, as if she were underwater. 5 years? The number rang in her head, echoing over and over again. 5 years to pay for a lifetime of mistakes. She barely noticed when her lawyer placed a hand on her shoulder, offering quiet words of reassurance. The courtroom began to empty, and as the crowd parted, her eyes met Jacob's. He was standing with his family, his face calm but unreadable. There was no triumph in his expression, no anger, just a quiet resignation. He nodded slightly, acknowledging her, and then he turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving Grace behind to face the consequences of her actions. Prison was not what Grace had imagined. In her mind, it had always been a place of chaos, violence, and suffering. And while there were elements of that, what struck her the most was the overwhelming sense of isolation. She had been taken to the women's correctional facility 2 days after the verdict, her mind still reeling from the reality of her sentence. The stark gray walls of the prison closed in around her as soon as she arrived, and the cold, sterile air seemed to seep into her bones. Everything felt hard: the floor, the walls, the bed. Her cell was small and bare, just a cot, a sink, and a toilet. It was a far cry from the neat, orderly home she had left behind in Chestnut Grove. The days in prison blurred together, each one like the last. Grace kept to herself, avoiding the other inmates as much as possible. She wasn't afraid of them exactly, but she had never been good at forming connections, and prison wasn't the place to start. So, she spent most of her time in silence, reflecting on her life, her mistakes, and the series of choices that had brought her here. The silence, though, was suffocating. There was no one left to control, no one left to blame. In the absence of her neighborhood routines and her role as the self-appointed keeper of Chestnut Grove's traditions, Grace was left with nothing but her own thoughts. And those thoughts were not kind. She thought about Richard, her late husband, more than ever. He had been a good man, patient and understanding in ways she had never fully appreciated. How many times had she pushed him, criticized him, demanded that he live up to the standards she had set for their life together? She had convinced herself that she was helping him, that her constant nagging was a way of keeping things in order. But now, sitting alone in her cell, she wondered if it had been something else. Had she been trying to control him the way she controlled everything else in her life? And then there was the accident, the hitandron that had haunted her for years. The image of Jacob lying on the pavement, waiting for help that never came, replayed in her mind over and over again. She had driven away that day, just as she had driven away from so many other things in her life, her emotions, her regrets, her relationships. But now there was no running. She was trapped in this cell, both physically and mentally, forced to confront the truth she had spent years avoiding. One night, unable to sleep, Grace lay on her cot, staring up at the ceiling. The sounds of the prison footsteps echoing down the hall, the distant murmur of voices faded into the background as her mind wandered. She thought about the wedding, the moment everything had come crashing down. She had been so consumed by her fear of change, her fear of losing control, that she had lashed out at Alex and Brooke, two people who had done nothing wrong. She had turned their joyful day into a spectacle of her own anger and bitterness. And for what? To preserve a sense of order that had never truly existed? To cling to a past that was slipping away no matter how tightly she tried to hold on. Grace closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her guilt settle over her like a heavy blanket. There was no undoing what she had done, no going back. All she could do now was live with the consequences. Months passed, and Grace settled into the monotonous rhythm of prison life. She spoke little, interacted with few, and spent most of her time in the small prison library, reading whatever books she could find. It was the only escape she had, though even the stories in the books couldn't fully distract her from the nagging guilt that had taken root in her heart. One afternoon, as she sat in the library, flipping through the pages of a worn-out novel, a guard approached her. "You have a visitor, Thompson." Grace looked up, startled. She hadn't had a visitor since she had been incarcerated. She didn't expect anyone who would come to see her. Her family had long since abandoned her, and the neighborhood had turned its back on her after the trial. She followed the guard to the visitation area, her heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and curiosity. When she stepped into the room, her breath caught in her throat. Brooke Johnson sat at one of the tables, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her expression calm but serious. Grace hesitated at the door, unsure of what to say or do. What was Brooke doing here? After everything Grace had done, why would she come to see her? Tentatively, Grace walked over to the table and sat down across from Brooke. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, unexpressed emotions. "I wanted to see you," Brooke said finally, her voice quiet but steady. Grace stared at her, confused. "Why?" Brooke took a deep breath. "Because I've been thinking a lot about what happened at the wedding. About you. About everything." Grace lowered her gaze, ashamed. "I ruined your day," she whispered. "I'm sorry?" Brooke nodded slowly. "You did, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I've been trying to understand. I've been trying to figure out why you did what you did." Grace didn't know how to respond. She didn't fully understand her own actions, let alone how to explain them to someone else. "I was afraid," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I was afraid of change. Afraid of losing control. I thought I was protecting something, but I was just, I don't know." Brooke's expression softened, though there was still a hint of sadness in her eyes. "I don't hate you, Mrs. Thompson. I was angry, really angry, but I don't hate you. I just hope you can find some peace." Grace felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "I don't deserve peace. Not after everything I've done." Brooke shook her head. "Everyone deserves a chance to make things right. Maybe you can't undo the past, but you can decide what you do with the future." Grace stared at her, overwhelmed by the kindness in Brooke's words. After everything, after all the hurt and pain she had caused, Brooke was still willing to offer her a path to redemption. "I don't know how," Grace whispered. "You'll figure it out," Brooke said gently. "We all have to." They sat in silence for a few moments longer before Brooke stood to leave. She offered Grace a small, encouraging smile before turning to walk away. As the door closed behind her, Grace felt a strange sense of lightness, a small glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still a way to atone for her past. In the weeks that followed Brooke's visit, Grace Thompson found herself replaying their conversation over and over again. The kindness in Brooke's voice had been unexpected, almost overwhelming. After years of anger, regret, and guilt, Grace wasn't sure she knew how to accept it. But it stayed with her, like a small light in the darkness she had been living in since arriving at the prison. Grace had always believed in control over her life, her neighborhood, and the people around her. It was how she kept the world from spiraling into chaos, how she made sense of things. But sitting in her cell, cut off from the world she once held in her grip, Grace had no choice but to confront the truth. Control had been an illusion. Each day, Grace spent her time quietly in the prison library, reading and thinking. The silence of her prison life gave her room to reflect. And for the first time in years, she began to unravel the tangled web of her choices. The wreckage of her life was laid bare before her, and she could no longer hide from the role she had played in creating it. The Hitandrin, of course, was always at the forefront of her mind. That day had changed everything. It had been the moment when she made the fateful decision to run rather than take responsibility. She could see now how that choice had shaped the rest of her life, how it had driven her deeper into her need for control, and how it had ultimately destroyed the person she once had the potential to be. And then there was Richard. Grace had often thought about him in the years since his death, but now, in the quiet of her cell, she allowed herself to remember him more clearly. His soft-spoken kindness, his patience, the way he had weathered her outbursts and endless demands. She had taken his love for granted, never realizing how much she had hurt him until it was too late. Grace wondered, not for the first time, if her nagging, her constant need to control him, had contributed to his early death. The doctors had said it was a heart attack, but deep down, she knew it was more than that. She had chipped away at him, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of the gentle man she had married. And yet, despite all of this, Brooke had come to visit her. Grace still couldn't fully grasp why. She had ruined Brooke's wedding day, thrown a shadow over what should have been the happiest moment of her life. And yet, instead of hatred or resentment, Brooke had offered Grace a kind of forgiveness she didn't think she deserved. That word forgiveness echoed in Grace's mind. She had always believed that some things were unforgivable. She had believed that once a mistake was made, once the line was crossed, there was no going back. But Brooke's visit had planted a seed of doubt. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past, but about finding a way to live with it. The problem was, Grace wasn't sure she knew how to forgive herself. Outside the prison walls, the world continued to move forward, just as it always did. Chestnut Grove, the neighborhood Grace had once ruled with an iron fist, was changing. And while Grace had once feared that change, Brooke and Alex Johnson had embraced it. Since their wedding, which had been marred by Grace's outburst, Brooke and Alex had poured their energy into helping the community heal. They wanted to ensure that no one in Chestnut Grove felt unwelcome or excluded the way Grace had tried to make them feel on their wedding day. The park, where the confrontation had taken place, had become a symbol of unity. Rather than allowing Grace's actions to define the space, Brooke and Alex worked to transform it into a gathering place for the entire community. They organized neighborhood events, picnics, and outdoor movie nights, inviting families from all backgrounds to come together and celebrate the diversity that was now a part of Chestnut Grove. Brooke had always believed in the power of community, and after everything that had happened, she wanted to create a place where everyone could feel that they belonged. It wasn't easy. There were still some who resisted the changes, who clung to the old ways like Grace once had, but slowly the neighborhood began to open up. The park became a place of joy, filled with laughter and the sound of children playing. People who had once kept their distance from one another now shared meals and stories. The rigid boundaries that Grace had so zealously enforced were dissolving, replaced by something more open, more welcoming. Alex, ever the optimist, had thrown himself into the project alongside Brooke. He had always believed that the best way to combat fear and prejudice was through understanding, and he was determined to help build a community where that was possible. He knew that it wouldn't happen overnight, but every time they hosted an event in the park, he saw the changes taking root. The tension that had once accompanied Grace's presence had lifted, and in its place was a sense of renewal. People were coming together in ways they hadn't before, bridging the gaps that had once divided them. The park had become a living testament to the power of love, resilience, and hope, everything that Brooke and Alex had envisioned when they first moved into the neighborhood. And in time, even those who had once sided with Grace began to soften. The world was changing, but it wasn't the threat that Grace had always feared. It was simply evolving, and those who were willing to embrace that evolution found themselves part of something greater than the small, tightly controlled world they had once known. Back in her prison cell, Grace continued to wrestle with the idea of redemption. Brooke's words had planted the seed, but Grace wasn't sure how to nurture it. She had spent so much of her life shutting people out, keeping her emotions tightly locked away, that the thought of opening herself up even to the idea of forgiveness was terrifying. One afternoon, as she sat alone in the prison yard, Grace watched the other inmates move around her. Some were talking in small groups, others were exercising, and a few sat quietly, much like herself, lost in their own thoughts. Grace had kept to herself since arriving, but now, for the first time, she wondered if that was part of the problem. She had lived her entire life on the outside, observing people, judging them, but never truly connecting. It had been easier that way, safer, but that distance had cost her. It had cost her her relationships, her family, and ultimately her freedom. And now, as she sat in this cold, unforgiving place, she realized that if she was ever going to find redemption, she couldn't do it alone. Grace wasn't sure where to start, but she knew that staying silent, staying isolated, wasn't the answer. She had to find a way to reach out, even if it was painful, even if it meant facing the things she had been running from for so long. The first step came in the form of a letter. It was a small, tentative act, but it was the only way Grace knew how to begin. She sat at the small desk in her cell, pen in hand, staring down at the blank piece of paper in front of her. The words didn't come easily, but after several minutes, she began to write. The letter was addressed to Jacob Anderson, the boy she had hit with her car all those years ago. Grace didn't know if he would read it, didn't know if he would even care, but she needed to do something. She needed to take responsibility, even if it was long overdue. In the letter, Grace wrote about the accident. She wrote about the fear that had gripped her in that moment, the panic that had driven her to flee instead of staying to help. She wrote about the guilt she had carried ever since, and how she had convinced herself that she was responsible. And finally, she wrote the words that had been stuck in her throat for years. "I'm sorry." When the letter was finished, Grace folded it carefully and handed it to the guard to be mailed. She didn't know if Jacob would forgive her. She wasn't even sure if she deserved forgiveness. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a small sense of relief. She had taken the first step, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start the journey toward redemption. Months passed, and Grace's time in prison continued. She was still alone much of the time, but after writing the letter to Jacob, something inside her had shifted. She no longer felt the crushing weight of guilt pressing down on her quite as heavily. It was still there, of course, but the act of reaching out, of taking responsibility, had lightened the load, if only slightly. One afternoon, as Grace sat in the prison library, a guard approached her with an envelope in hand. It was small and plain, but the moment Grace saw it, her heart skipped a beat. She recognized the handwriting on the front: Jacob Anderson. With trembling hands, Grace opened the envelope and pulled out the letter inside. She hadn't expected a response, not so soon, and maybe not ever. But here it was, in her hands. The letter was short, but it was enough. Jacob wrote that he had received her letter and that he had read it. He didn't offer forgiveness, at least not directly, but he thanked her for taking responsibility. He wrote that he had spent years waiting for an apology, not because it would undo the past, but because it would acknowledge the pain he had lived with for so long. And while he didn't say the words "I forgive you," Grace could sense that in some small way the letter had been a step toward healing, not just for her, but for Jacob as well. Grace sat in the library, the letter resting in her lap, her heart full of emotions she didn't quite know how to process. For the first time in years, she felt a small glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could begin to make amends for the mistakes she had made. Grace sat alone on her cot, Jacob's letter resting in her hands. His words had stirred something deep inside her, a feeling she hadn't known she was capable of any more relief. It wasn't full forgiveness, she hadn't expected that, but it was acknowledgement. Jacob had read her apology, and he understood that she was trying, even after all these years, to make things right. In the days that followed, Grace found herself reflecting on how far she had come since the day she'd been arrested. When she'd first arrived at the prison, she had been filled with bitterness and anger, certain that her life was over. But now a small light had started to grow inside her, a hope that, even after everything, she could still change. She couldn't undo the past, but she could live differently going forward. Grace knew that true redemption wasn't about receiving forgiveness from others, it was about coming to terms with her own guilt. Jacob's letter had given her a sense of closure, but she still had work to do on herself. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in years, she felt ready to walk it. One morning, Grace was sitting in the prison yard, watching as the other inmates milled around her. She had kept her distance from most of them since her arrival, too consumed by her own guilt and grief to reach out. But now, as she sat there, she realized that perhaps she wasn't as alone as she had once thought. She noticed a woman sitting a few yards away, her shoulders slumped in a way that Grace recognized all too well. The woman's name was Maria, and she had arrived at the prison only a few months after Grace. They had never spoken, but Grace had often seen her sitting alone, lost in thought. For a moment, Grace hesitated. She wasn't used to making the first move, and the idea of reaching out to someone else felt foreign to her. But something had shifted inside her since writing to Jacob. She had come to understand that part of her healing process was learning to connect with others, to offer and receive support. Grace stood up and walked over to Maria, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what to say, but when she reached the bench where Maria sat, she simply said, "Mind if I sit?" Maria looked up, surprised, but after a moment she nodded. Grace sat down beside her, the two women sitting in silence for a while. It wasn't uncomfortable, though just quiet. "I've seen you around," Maria said finally, her voice soft. "You keep to yourself." Grace nodded. "I've had a lot to think about." Maria gave her a small, understanding smile. "Haven't we all?" They fell into another stretch of silence, but this time it felt more companionable. Grace didn't know much about Mariah's story, but she didn't need to. They were both here for a reason, and in that shared experience, there was a kind of unspoken bond. As the days passed, Grace found herself sitting with Maria more often, and slowly they began to talk. At first, the conversations were surface level about prison routines, books they were reading, the weather, But over time, Grace began to open up. She told Maria about the accident, about Jacob, and about how her life had spiraled out of control after years of trying to control everything around her. Maria listened without judgment, offering Grace something she hadn't realized: she needed empathy. For so long, Grace had been trapped in her own mind, unable to connect with others. But now, she had found someone who understood the weight of guilt and regret. It wasn't a grand transformation, but it was a step. And in that small step, Grace found a new sense of purpose. While Grace worked to rebuild her life within the prison walls, the world outside continued to change in ways she never could have imagined. Brooke and Alex Johnson had become central figures in the Chestnut Grove community. Their efforts to turn the Parkons, the site of Grace's confrontation, into a symbol of unity and inclusion had begun to pay off. The community center they had helped establish had become a gathering place for families of all backgrounds. Workshops, cultural festivals, and family events now filled the park regularly, drawing in people from all walks of life. One Saturday afternoon, Brooke stood in the park, watching as a group of children played on the grassy field. The sun was shining, casting a golden light over the scene, and Brooke couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for how far they had come. It hadn't been easy. There had been resistance, of course. Some of the older residents had been wary of the changes, reluctant to let go of the rigid traditions that had once defined Chestnut Grove. But slowly, over time, those walls had come down. Neighbors who had once kept their distance were now talking, sharing meals, and working together to build something new. The wedding fiasco had brought out the worst in some people, but it had also ignited a conversation about what kind of neighborhood they wanted to be. Brooke and Alex had led that conversation, pushing for a community that embraced change rather than feared it. And now, as Brooke watched the children running across the park, their laughter ringing out into the afternoon air, she knew they had succeeded. Alex walked over to join her, a warm smile on his face. "Looks like a good turnout," he said, gesturing to the crowd of families gathered around picnic tables and food stalls. Brooke nodded. "It's amazing, isn't it? I never thought we'd come this far." Alex slipped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "We did it together." Brooke smiled, leaning into him. It hadn't been an easy journey, but it had been worth it. And as they stood there, watching the community they had helped build come to life, Brooke felt a deep sense of peace. They had turned something painful into something beautiful. Back in the prison, Grace continued her slow journey toward healing. She and Maria had grown closer, and through their friendship, Grace had begun to see that she wasn't as alone as she had once thought. But there was still one more step Grace knew she needed to take. One afternoon, as she sat in the prison library, Grace found herself thinking about Richard. She had spent so many years avoiding the pain of his loss, blaming his death on everything but herself. But now, in the quiet of her cell, she allowed herself to face the truth. Richard had been a good man. He had loved her, supported her, and tried to make her happy, even when she made it difficult. And Grace had repaid him with criticism, with endless demands, with her constant need for control. She had pushed him until there was nothing left, and in doing so, she had lost the one person who had truly loved her. For the first time in years, Grace allowed herself to cry. The tears came slowly at first, but then they flowed freely, years of guilt and regret pouring out of her. She had been so focused on maintaining order, on keeping everything in its place, that she had missed what really mattered. As she wiped her tears, Grace realized that while she couldn't change the past, she could honor Richard's memory by changing herself. She could let go of the need for control, the need to be right, and instead focus on being kind, being open, and being present. It wouldn't be easy. Grace knew that forgiveness, both for herself and from others, would take time. But she was willing to try. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of hope. 2 years had passed since Grace had been sentenced, and while her time in prison wasn't over, she had begun to find a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Her friendship with Maria had deepened, and together they had formed a small support group with some of the other women in the prison. It wasn't much, but it was something a way for Grace to give back, to help others in the same way Brooke and Maria had helped her. One day, as Grace sat in the prison yard with Maria, a guard approached them. "Thompson," he said, "you've got a visitor." Grace's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't had a visitor in months, not since Brooke's visit. She followed the guard to the visitation room, her mind racing with thoughts of who it could be. When she entered the room, she froze. Sitting at the table was Matthew, her son. He looked older, more tired than she remembered, but he was still the same boy she had raised, the boy she had pushed away with her endless expectations. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Grace could feel the tension in the air, but there was something else too, something softer, something that felt like possibility. "Hi, Mom," Matthew said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of emotions. Grace sat down across from him, her eyes filled with tears. "Matthew," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." Matthew looked at her for a long moment before nodding. "I know, Mom. I know. It wasn't a full reconciliation, not yet. But it was a start." And as Grace sat there with her son, she knew that, for the first time in her life, she was ready to move forward. In the final months of Grace's sentence, she found herself thinking less about the mistakes she had made and more about the future. She had spent so many years clinging to the past, to the rigid structures she had built around her life, that the idea of looking forward felt strange. But now, as her release date approached, Grace felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Her journey wasn't over. There were still relationships to mend, apologies to make, and a lifetime of guilt to process. But she was no longer the person she had been when she entered the prison. She was ready to face whatever came next, and she was determined to do so with an open heart. The day of her release came quietly. There were no grand gestures, no tearful goodbyes, just Grace walking through the gates and stepping into the world once more. The air felt different out here, freer, lighter, and for the first time in years, Grace allowed herself to breathe deeply. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain: she would face it with grace. A year after her release, Grace stood at the edge of the park in Chestnut Grove, watching as families gathered for a summer festival. The park looked different now, more alive, more welcoming. It was no longer the tightly controlled space she had once patrolled with hawk-like vigilance. Instead, it had become a symbol of everything she had once feared change. And yet, standing there, Grace didn't feel the old resentment rising in her chest. Instead, she felt a quiet sense of peace. The community had moved on without her, and it was better for it. The changes she had once fought so hard to resist had brought life and love to the neighborhood in ways she had never imagined. As she watched the children play, Grace noticed a familiar face among the crowd. Brooke and Alex were there, laughing as they watched their own children run across the grass. Brooke caught Grace's eye and smiled, a small but genuine gesture of understanding. Grace smiled back. She didn't approach them. This was their day, their community, their future. But as she stood there, watching from a distance, Grace felt something she hadn't felt in years. Forgiveness. For herself, for her past, for all the things she had done and the person she had been. And in that moment, Grace knew that while her story had been filled with pain and regret, it wasn't the end. She had been given a second chance, no, to undo the past, but to live the rest of her life with kindness, compassion, and understanding. And for that, she was grateful. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, don't forget to subscribe, hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on the story. I'd love to hear what you think about Grace's journey and the lessons she learned. Thanks for watching or listening, and see you in the next one. These concerns had nothing to do with their academic qualifications and everything to do with their race. Aldridge tried to discredit Emily's testimony, suggesting that she was biased because of her progressive views, but it was clear that her words had struck a chord. The jury listened intently, and the mood in the courtroom shifted. After weeks of testimony, cross-examinations, and arguments from both sides, the trial reached its final day. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the jury prepared to deliver their verdict. The Carters sat together, their hands intertwined, bracing for whatever was to come. The jury foreman stood and addressed the court. In the case of Carter versus Brookwood Academy, we, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiffs. There was a collective gasp in the courtroom as the words sank in. The Carters had won. Tears filled Vanessa's eyes as she squeezed Ethan's hand. Jasmine and Chloe, who had remained stoic throughout the trial, finally let out the breath they had been holding. It was over. They had won. The jury found that Brookwood Academy had indeed engaged in discriminatory practices and had violated Jasmine and Chloe's right to an equal education. The school was ordered to pay damages to the Carters, but more importantly, they were required to make immediate changes to their admissions policies, ensuring that no student would ever again be rejected based on race. The media erupted with the news. Headlines declared the Carters' victory as a landmark case in the fight against racial discrimination in private education. Civil rights groups hailed the decision as a major step forward, and parents across the country began to look more closely at the policies of their children's schools. Outside the courthouse, a large crowd had gathered. Supporters cheered as the Carter family emerged, holding their heads high. Ethan addressed the crowd, his voice filled with pride and emotion. "This victory is not just for my daughters," Ethan said, his voice carrying over the noise of the crowd. "This is for every student who has ever been told they don't belong because of the color of their skin. This is for every family who has had to fight just to be seen, just to be heard. We are not done fighting, but today we take a step forward. Today justice was served." The crowd roared in response, and Jasmine and Chloe smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. They had fought hard, and now they could finally begin to heal. In the wake of the verdict, Brookwood Academy faced a reckoning unlike anything it had experienced in its long history. The school's reputation had been severely damaged by the trial, and Mr. Graham's resignation was not enough to stem the tide of criticism. Under the leadership of Emily Henderson, who had been appointed as the new headmistress following the verdict, Brookwood began to make the changes mandated by the court. Emily wasted no time in overhauling the admissions process, removing the vague cultural fit criteria that had been used to discriminate against students of color. In its place, she implemented new policies designed to ensure transparency and fairness, with a focus on promoting diversity and inclusion. But it wasn't just the admissions process that needed reform. Brookwood's culture had to change as well. Emily worked with faculty and students to create programs that would foster a more inclusive environment, where all students, regardless of race, felt welcome and valued. She introduced workshops on racial bias and privilege, brought in guest speakers from diverse backgrounds, and encouraged open discussions about race and equity. For some members of the Brookwood community, these changes were long overdue. Teachers who had quietly supported the Carters throughout the trial were finally able to speak out, sharing their own experiences of witnessing discrimination at the school. Parents who had been hesitant to get involved in the controversy now voiced their support for the new direction the school was taking. But not everyone was on board. A vocal minority of parents and alumni resisted the changes, claiming that Brookwood was abandoning its traditions in favor of political correctness. Some families withdrew their children from the school, and a few of the school's wealthiest donors cut off their financial support in protest. Despite these challenges, Emily remained steadfast. She knew that real change would take time, but she was determined to lead Brookwood into a new era where every student, regardless of background, had an equal opportunity to succeed. As for Mr. Graham, his departure from Brookwood was swift and quiet. He had once been a powerful figure in the world of elite education, but the trial had tarnished his reputation beyond repair. He retired from public life, leaving behind a legacy of exclusion and prejudice that Brookwood was now working to undo. The day finally came when Jasmine and Chloe would return to Brookwood Academy. It was a day they had both anticipated and dreaded in equal measure. The school was different now. There were new faces, new policies, and a new atmosphere of openness, but it was still the same place where they had been rejected, where they had felt like outsiders. As they walked through the gates hand in hand, Jasmine and Chloe were met with curious glances from their peers. Some students smiled, offering tentative waves of welcome. Others, The ones who had always seen them as outsiders looked away, unwilling to acknowledge the change that had come to Brookwood. But Jasmine and Chloe didn't let the stares or the whispers deter them. They walked into the building with their heads held high, knowing that they had earned their place here, not just because of their academic achievements, but because of the fight they had won. The first few weeks were challenging. Jasmine, always driven, threw herself back into her studies, determined to succeed on her own terms. Chloe, still more reserved, found solace in her art classes, where she could express the emotions she had been carrying for so long. Both girls had moments of doubt, moments where they wondered if they would ever truly feel at home at Brookwood. But slowly, as the school adjusted to its new reality, they began to find their footing. Teachers, many of whom had quietly supported the Carters throughout their ordeal, went out of their way to make sure Jasmine and Chloe felt included. Fellow students who had once been distant now reached out, inviting them to study groups and extracurricular activities. Bit by bit, the school began to feel less like a battleground and more like a place where they could thrive. One afternoon, as Jasmine and Chloe were leaving school, they stopped by the newly created Diversity and Inclusion Office, which had been established as part of the school's reforms. Inside, they saw a group of younger students, Black, Latino, Asian, gathered around a table, discussing ideas for a new student-led initiative to promote equity at Brookwood. Jasmine smiled as she watched them. She turned to Chloe, her voice filled with quiet pride. "This is why we fought. So they wouldn't have to." Chloe nodded, her eyes softening. "Yeah, we did it." As they walked out of the building, the sun setting behind them, the weight of the past year finally began to lift. They had faced unimaginable challenges, but they had emerged stronger, not just for themselves, but for the students who would come after them. Months after the trial, Ethan sat in his office, reflecting on the journey his family had been through. The fight had been long and grueling, but they had won. And while the victory in court had been important, it was the deeper, more personal victories that meant the most to him. He thought about Jasmine and Chloe, how they had grown into strong, resilient young women over the course of the battle. He thought about Vanessa, who had fought alongside him every step of the way, balancing her roles as lawyer, mother, and advocate with grace and determination. He thought about the moments when it had seemed like they might lose everything, but somehow they had found the strength to keep going. As a senator, Ethan had always believed in the power of the law to bring about change. But this case had taught him something deeper, that real change comes not just from legal victories, but from the courage to stand up and say, "This is wrong, and we won't accept it." He knew that their fight wasn't over. The issues they had faced at Brookwood were just a small part of the larger system of inequality that permeated society. But their victory had shown that change was possible, that the system could be challenged, and that families like his could make a difference. Ethan leaned back in his chair, a sense of peace settling over him. For the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. They had won one battle, but there were many more to fight. And with his family by his side, he was ready for whatever came next. The Carter family's victory in court had sent shockwaves through the country, igniting conversations about racial inequality and systemic discrimination in education. The case had become a touchstone for civil rights activists, educators, and families who had experienced similar discrimination in other schools. It wasn't long before other institutions began to face scrutiny, with families stepping forward to challenge discriminatory practices at private and public schools alike. The Carter case had not only reshaped Brookwood Academy, but it had also sparked a movement. Across social media, hashtags like Justice for All Students and Equal Education for All trended for weeks, with thousands of people sharing their stories of exclusion and discrimination. Civil rights organizations used the momentum to push for new policies that would address racial disparities in schools nationwide. Ethan, who had always been a vocal advocate for equal rights, was now thrust into the national spotlight. As a senator, his platform had expanded, and he used it to champion legislative reform aimed at dismantling systemic barriers in education. He proposed a bill that would mandate stricter oversight of private school admissions processes, ensuring transparency and preventing discrimination based on race, socioeconomic status, or other factors. "This is just the beginning," Ethan said during a televised interview, his voice resolute. "We've taken a step forward, but we have a long way to go. Every child deserves an equal opportunity to succeed, no matter where they come from or what they look like. We won't stop fighting until that's a reality." The bill gained traction in Congress, with bipartisan support from lawmakers who recognize the importance of addressing inequality in education. Ethan found himself working closely with civil rights leaders, community organizers, and fellow politicians to build a coalition that would push the bill forward. Meanwhile, Vanessa was also making an impact. As a high-profile lawyer with expertise in discrimination cases, she became a sought-after speaker at conferences and legal forums where she discussed the implications of the Carter case and the need for ongoing legal reform. She received invitations to speak at law schools where students were eager to learn from her experience and insight. "I've always believed that the law is a tool for justice," Vanessa said during one such event. "But it's only as powerful as the people who wield it. We have to keep pushing, keep fighting, and keep using the law to hold institutions accountable." The Carter case wasn't just a win for my family, it was a win for every family that has ever faced discrimination. For Jasmine and Chloe, the ripple effect of their case was deeply personal. They began receiving messages from students all over the country, many of whom shared their own experiences of feeling like outsiders in predominantly white institutions. Jasmine, in particular, felt a responsibility to respond to these messages, offering words of encouragement and solidarity. One day, Jasmine received a letter from a young girl in Texas who had been rejected from a prestigious private school under similar circumstances. The girl wrote about how she had been told she didn't fit the culture of the school, despite her academic qualifications. She had felt defeated, but after reading about the Carter case, she decided to fight back. "Your story gave me the courage to stand up for myself," the girl wrote. "Thank you for showing me that I deserve a place at the table, no matter what anyone says." Jasmine was moved to tears as she read the letter. She realized that their fight hadn't just been for themselves, it had been for every student who had ever been told they didn't belong. And now, those students were finding their voices and pushing back against the system. At Brookwood Academy, the changes initiated by Emily Henderson continued to transform the school. With new policies in place, the admissions process became more transparent, and the focus shifted toward building a truly inclusive community. The school's Diversity and Inclusion Office, created in the wake of the lawsuit, became a central hub for student-led initiatives aimed at promoting equity and addressing bias. One of the first major changes was the formation of a student advisory board, which included representatives from different racial, cultural, and socioeconomic backgrounds. Jasmine and Chloe were invited to join the board, and while they were initially hesitant, they saw it as an opportunity to help shape the future of Brookwood. The first meeting of the advisory board was filled with nervous energy as students from different grades and backgrounds gathered to discuss their visions for the school. Jasmine, who had always been more outspoken, took the lead, while Chloe offered her quiet but insightful input. "We need to make sure that the changes we're making aren't just on paper," Jasmine said during the meeting. "It's not enough to change the admissions process, we need to change the way people think. We need to create a culture where everyone feels like they belong, no matter who they are." The other students nodded in agreement, and soon the conversation flowed freely, with ideas for workshops, cultural events, and mentorship programs aimed at fostering understanding and unity within the student body. Under Emily's leadership, Brookwood also began reaching out to communities that had been historically underrepresented at the school. They partnered with local organizations to recruit students from diverse backgrounds and provided scholarships to ensure that financial barriers wouldn't prevent deserving students from attending. Emily herself worked tirelessly to rebuild trust within the Brookwood community. She held regular town hall meetings with parents and faculty, where she addressed concerns and shared updates on the school's progress. She made it clear that Brookwood was committed to becoming a leader in educational equity. And while some parents remained resistant, The majority embraced the changes. One afternoon, as Jasmine and Chloe were leaving school, they stopped to talk with Emily, who was walking across the campus. "You've both done so much to help make these changes happen," Emily said, her voice warm with admiration. "Brookwood is better because of you." Jasmine smiled, feeling a sense of pride. "It wasn't just us. A lot of people fought to make this happen." "True," Emily replied, "but you were the spark that ignited the change." As Jasmine and Chloe walked away, they reflected on how far they had come. They had once felt like outsiders, unsure of their place at Brookwood, but now they were part of something much bigger, a movement toward a more just and inclusive future. While Brookwood Academy was undergoing a transformation, the Carter family was focused on rebuilding trust, both within their own family and in the community. The emotional toll of the lawsuit and the public scrutiny had been immense, but now that the battle was behind them, they were beginning to heal. Ethan and Vanessa, who had always been a strong team, took time to reconnect with each other and with their daughters. They made a conscious effort to spend more time together as a family, away from the pressures of their respective careers. Weekend trips, family dinners, and quiet evenings at home became a regular part of their routine. For Jasmine and Chloe, the process of rebuilding trust within themselves was more personal. The past year had tested their resilience, but it had also taught them important lessons about their own strength and the power of their voices. Jasmine, who had always felt the need to prove herself academically, began to let go of the idea that her worth was tied to her achievements. She realized that her place at Brookwood wasn't something she had to justify, it was something she had earned. She also started to explore her interests outside of academics, joining the school's debate team and getting involved in student government. Chloe, who had struggled with anxiety and self-doubt, found solace in her art. She began to use her creativity as an outlet for her emotions, expressing through painting and drawing what she couldn't always put into words. Her art teacher noticed her talent and encouraged her to showcase her work in the school's annual art exhibit. "I didn't think anyone would want to see my stuff," Chloe admitted one afternoon, as she showed her parents one of her latest paintings. Vanessa smiled, admiring the vibrant colors and intricate details of Chloe's work. "Your art is beautiful, Chloe. You have a gift, and the world deserves to see it." With her parents' encouragement, Chloe agreed to submit her work to the exhibit. On the day of the event, as students and parents wandered through the gallery, Chloe watched nervously from the sidelines, unsure of how her art would be received. But as people stopped to admire her paintings, offering compliments, and asking about her process, she felt a sense of validation she hadn't expected. One of the visitors to the exhibit was Professor Reynolds, the board member who had supported the changes at Brookwood. He paused in front of one of Chloe's paintings, studying it carefully. "This is remarkable," he said, turning to Chloe with a smile. "You have a real talent." Chloe blushed, feeling both proud and shy at the same time. "Thank you. It means a lot." As the evening went on, Chloe realized that she had found her place not just as a student at Brookwood, but as an artist with a voice of her own. The Carter family had been through a storm, but they had come out stronger on the other side. With the lawsuit behind them and Brookwood Academy on a new path, they were ready to focus on what mattered most to each other. One summer evening, the family gathered in their backyard for a barbecue, a tradition they had started before the chaos of the lawsuit had consumed their lives. The smell of grilled food filled the air as they laughed and talked, enjoying the simple pleasure of being together. Jasmine and Chloe sat on the patio, reminiscing about their first day at Brookwood and how much had changed since then. "I never thought we'd get through all of that," Jasmine said, sipping lemonade. "But here we are." Chloe nodded, her eyes softening. "I'm glad we didn't give up. It was hard, but we made it." Ethan joined them, holding a plate of burgers and hot dogs. He smiled at his daughters, pride radiating from him. "You two are the strongest people I know. You fought for what was right, and you made a difference." Vanessa, carrying a bowl of salad, sat down beside Ethan. She placed a hand on his arm, her expression filled with love and gratitude. "We all made a difference, and we did it together." As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the backyard, the Carters sat around the table eating and laughing, the weight of the past year finally lifted. They knew that there would always be challenges ahead, but they were ready to face them together. That night, as Jasmine and Chloe sat outside, looking up at the stars, they reflected on how far they had come. They had been tested in ways they never could have imagined, but they had emerged stronger, more confident, and more certain of their place in the world. "I think we're going to be okay," Chloe said softly, her gaze fixed on the sky. Jasmine smiled, her heart full. "Yeah, we're going to be just fine." Months after the lawsuit had ended, the Carter family continued to move forward, both personally and professionally. Ethan's proposed bill on educational reform was gaining momentum in Congress, with support from lawmakers across the political spectrum. The bill aimed to establish nationwide guidelines for private school admissions, ensuring that no student would be discriminated against based on race, socioeconomic status, or background. On the day of the vote, Ethan stood in the Senate chamber, addressing his colleagues with the same passion that had driven him throughout the Brookwood case. "This bill is about fairness," he said, his voice steady but powerful. "It's about giving every child a fair shot at success. It's about ensuring that no student is ever told they don't belong because of the color of their skin. We've come a long way, but we still have work to do. And it starts here, with this bill." As the vote was cast, the bill passed with overwhelming support, marking a major victory in the fight for educational equity. Ethan, standing in the Senate chamber, allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. The fight was far from over, but this was a step in the right direction. Meanwhile, Vanessa continued to work on cases related to racial discrimination, using her platform to advocate for families facing similar challenges. She became a mentor to young lawyers, sharing her knowledge and experience to help them navigate the complexities of civil rights law. For Jasmine and Chloe, life at Brookwood had settled into a new normal. They continued to thrive academically, but they also made time for the things they loved: debating, painting, and building friendships with students from all walks of life. One afternoon, as the sisters sat in the school library, Chloe looked up from her sketchbook and smiled at Jasmine. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't fought back?" Chloe asked. Jasmine thought for a moment, then shook her head. "I don't like to think about that. What matters is that we did fight, and because of that, everything changed." Chloe nodded, her eyes bright with determination. "We should be proud of that." "We are," Jasmine said, her voice filled with certainty. "We made a difference." As the sisters packed up their things and headed out of the library, they knew that their fight had been worth it. They had faced adversity and come out stronger, and they had helped pave the way for a future where every student, regardless of race or background, could walk through the doors of opportunity with their head held high. The road ahead was long, but the Carters were ready for it. Thank you so much for following the Carter family's journey to justice and equality. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more about powerful narratives that challenge society, inspire change, and explore the human experience, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss out on new content. Together, we can continue to share stories that matter. See you in the next one. "The police are on their way, Derek. You've lost." Derek's eyes darted around, realizing for the first time that the entire street was watching him. His bravado faltered, his shoulders tensing as he took in the growing crowd of neighbors, all standing together in a show of solidarity. For a moment, it seemed like Derek might lash out, might do something reckless. But then slowly, the fight drained out of him. His fists unclenched, his shoulders slumped, and with one last look at Edith filled with hatred and resentment, he turned and stormed back to his car. The street was silent as Derek sped away, his tires screeching against the pavement. Edith's breath came in shallow gasps, her heart still racing from the confrontation. She stood there for a moment, frozen, until Bill crossed the street and stood beside her. "You okay, Edith?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Edith nodded, though her legs still felt shaky. "I'm okay," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thanks to all of you." Bill smiled warmly, giving her a reassuring nod. "We're not going to let him hurt you, Edith. Not now, not ever." Edith's eyes filled with tears, But they weren't tears of fear, they were tears of gratitude. She had been afraid for so long, but now, standing here with her neighbors by her side, she felt a renewed sense of strength. She wasn't alone. In the days following the final confrontation with Derek, the neighborhood watch remained vigilant, but the sense of fear that had once gripped Cedar Street began to dissipate. Derek hadn't returned, and Edith had received word from the police that he was being closely monitored. They had issued a restraining order, preventing Derek from coming within a certain distance of Edith's home or the shelter where Rachel and the girls were staying. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was enough to give Edith peace of mind for now. Rachel called regularly, checking in to see how Edith was doing and updating her on their progress. The shelter had helped her find legal representation, and she was working towards securing full custody of the girls and filing for divorce from Derek. It was a long, difficult road, but Rachel was determined to keep moving forward. "The girls are adjusting," Rachel said during one phone call, her voice sounding stronger, more confident. "They're starting to sleep better, and we're getting used to our new routine. It's still hard sometimes, but I feel like we're finally free." Edith smiled, her heart swelling with pride for Rachel. She had come so far, and though there were still challenges ahead, Edith knew that Rachel had the strength to face them. "I'm so proud of you," Edith said softly. "You're doing such a good job, Rachel. You and the girls are going to be just fine." Rachel hesitated for a moment, then her voice softened. "We couldn't have done it without you, Edith. You saved us. I'll never be able to thank you enough for everything you've done." Tears welled in Edith's eyes, and she wiped them away with a smile. "You're family now, Rachel, and family takes care of each other." As Edith hung up the phone, a sense of calm settled over her. She had faced her fears, stood up to Derek, and helped Rachel and the girls escape a dangerous situation. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Her home, once a place of quiet solitude, had become a symbol of strength and resilience. And her neighbors, once strangers, had become a community, united by a shared sense of purpose. Life on Cedar Street would never be the same again, but that was okay. Because now it is filled with hope, connection, and the promise of a better future. Edith smiled as she stepped out into her garden, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the roses. She knelt down, her hands gently tending to the flowers, feeling the cool earth beneath her fingertips. There was still work to be done, but now she knew she wasn't doing it alone. In the weeks that followed Derek's final confrontation, a new sense of peace settled over Cedar Street. The neighborhood watch remained vigilant, but the need for constant worry had lessened as Derek's presence faded from their lives. He hadn't returned, and the restraining order kept him at a safe distance from Edith's home and from the shelter where Rachel and the girls were living. Edith found herself breathing easier with each passing day, the weight of fear slowly lifting from her shoulders. One crisp autumn morning, as Edith was pruning her roses, she heard the familiar ring of her phone from inside the house. She wiped her hands on her gardening apron and hurried to answer it, her heart lifting when she saw Rachel's name on the caller ID. "Rachel, it's so good to hear from you," Edith said, a smile spreading across her face as she held the phone to her ear. "Hi, Edith," Rachel replied, her voice filled with warmth. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Not at all, dear. Just tending to the garden. How are you and the girls doing?" Rachel let out a small sigh, though it was one of relief rather than stress. "We're doing really well, actually. The girls are starting to settle in at school, and they're making new friends. We've been staying at the shelter for a while now, but I've been working with a caseworker. And, well, we found a place. It's a small apartment, but it's ours." Edith's heart swelled with joy at the news. "Rachel, that's wonderful. I'm so happy for you. I couldn't have done it without your help, Edith. Really? I mean it. You were there for me when I didn't know what to do. I'll never be able to thank you enough." "You've already thanked me more than enough, Rachel," Edith said gently. "I'm just glad you and the girls are safe and moving forward." "We are," Rachel agreed, her voice steady. "We still have some hard days, but we're starting to rebuild. I'm learning how to live without looking over my shoulder all the time. The girls, they've been through so much, but I think they're going to be okay." Edith felt a tear slip down her cheek, and she wiped it away with a smile. You're an incredible mother, Rachel. You've given them the chance to have a better life, and that's the most important thing. Thank you, Rachel whispered, her voice filled with emotion. I wanted to ask, would you like to come visit us when we're settled into the apartment? The girls miss you, and they'd love for you to see our new place. I'd love that, Edith replied without hesitation. I can't wait to see how far you've come. After they said their goodbyes, Edith stood in the quiet of her kitchen, a deep sense of pride and peace settling over her. She had been part of something important, helping Rachel and her daughters escape a dangerous situation and start a new life. Knowing that they were safe and thriving gave Edith a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in a long time. But Edith also knew that healing wasn't just for Rachel and the girls. She, too, had been deeply affected by everything that had happened. For so long, Edith had lived in a world of solitude, wrapped in the memories of her past life with Richard. But now she realized that she had the power to create new connections, to make a difference in the lives of others. Her small, quiet world had expanded in ways she never could have predicted. A few weeks later, Edith stood in front of the door to Rachel's new apartment, her heart racing with anticipation. She held a basket filled with homemade cookies and a small potted plant, a housewarming gift for Rachel and the girls. As she knocked on the door, she couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement and pride. Rachel had taken such brave steps toward building a new life for herself and her daughters, and Edith was eager to see the progress they had made. The door opened, and there stood Rachel, her face lighting up with a wide smile. Edith, you made it. Of course I did, Edith replied warmly, stepping inside and hugging Rachel. I wouldn't miss this for the world. The apartment was small but cozy, filled with the warmth and light that Edith had come to associate with Rachel. The walls were adorned with colorful artwork, some drawn by Lily and Ivy, and the space felt alive with the energy of a family building something new. Edith smiled as she took it all in, her heart swelling with pride for Rachel's resilience. Look who's here, Rachel called out. And moments later, Lily and Ivy came bounding into the room, their faces bright with excitement. Grandma Edith, they exclaimed in unison, rushing toward her and wrapping their arms around her. Edith laughed, bending down to hug the girls. Oh, my dears, it's so good to see you. We missed you, Ivy said, her voice small but filled with warmth. Can you stay for dinner? I wouldn't dream of leaving before dinner, Edith replied, her heart swelling with affection for the girls. As they settled into the living room, Rachel brought out a pot of tea, and the four of them spent the afternoon catching up, laughing, and sharing stories. The girls proudly showed Edith their artwork, and Rachel talked about how they were adjusting to their new school and making friends. They're doing so well, Rachel said, her voice filled with relief and pride. I wasn't sure how they would handle all the changes, but they've been so strong. I'm so proud of them. You should be proud of yourself too, Edith said gently. You've created a safe, loving home for them. That's everything. Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening with tears of gratitude. I still can't believe we made it. There were times when I thought we'd never get out, but now we have a chance at a real life. As the afternoon turned into evening, the conversation grew deeper, and Edith and Rachel found themselves reflecting on everything that had happened over the past few months. There had been so much pain, fear, and uncertainty, but now there was also hope. They had made it through the storm, and now they were standing on the other side, ready to rebuild their lives. I never thought I'd feel free, Rachel admitted quietly, her voice heavy with emotion. But now I wake up every morning knowing that I'm safe, that my girls are safe. And that's everything. Edith reached out and took Rachel's hand, squeezing it gently. You deserve this peace, Rachel. You and the girls deserve all the happiness in the world. Rachel nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. And you deserve it too, Edith. You've been through so much yourself. You've given us a new start, and I hope you know how much that means to me. Edith smiled, her heart full. We've given each other a new start. Later that evening, after dinner, and one last round of hugs from Lily and Ivy, Edith said her goodbyes and made her way back to her own home. As she walked down the quiet street, she felt a deep sense of contentment. Life had changed in ways she never could have predicted, but it was better now richer, fuller, and filled with new connections. Rachel and the girls had become like family to her, and Edith knew that their bond would only grow stronger as they continued to support one another in the days ahead. As the autumn leaves began to fall and the air turned crisp, Edith found herself spending more time in her garden, reflecting on the past few months. So much had changed, not just for Rachel and the girls, but for Edith as well. Her life, once quiet and isolated, had been transformed by the relationships she had built and the strength she had discovered within herself. But with that transformation came a deeper understanding of the weight she had been carrying for so long: grief, the loneliness, the sense of being left behind. Richard's death had left a hole in Edith's life, one that she had tried to fill with routine and solitude. But now, with Rachel and the girls in her life, Edith realized that she didn't have to carry that weight alone anymore. One afternoon, as Edith sat in the garden with a cup of tea, she found herself thinking about Richard. She missed him every day, missed his laugh, his warmth, the way he had always made her feel safe and loved. But for the first time in a long time, Edith felt a sense of peace when she thought of him, peace in knowing that he would have been proud of her for everything she had done to help Rachel and the girls. As she sipped her tea, Edith decided it was time to visit Richard's grave. She hadn't been in a while, and she felt a strong pull to go to tell him about everything that had happened, about the new life she had found after all these years. The next day, Edith drove to the cemetery where Richard was buried. The drive was quiet, the fall colors painting the landscape in shades of gold and red. When she arrived, Edith made her way to Richard's headstone, a small smile on her face as she placed a bouquet of fresh roses at his grave. "Hello, love," she said softly, her voice filled with affection. "It's been a while, but I've been busy. I have so much to tell you." For the next hour, Edith sat by Richard's grave, telling him about Rachel, about the girls, about everything that had happened since they had moved into the neighborhood. She talked about how she had found new strength within herself, how she had made new friends, and how she had learned that it was never too late to make a difference in someone's life. "I think you'd be proud of me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know I've still got a lot of life left to live, and I'm going to make the most of it. I'll carry your love with me, always." As Edith stood to leave, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She knew that Richard was still with her, in spirit, and that his love would continue to guide her in the days ahead. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. As the winter holidays approached, Cedar Street came alive with the warm glow of twinkling lights and the festive spirit of the season. Edith, who had once dreaded the long, lonely winter months, now found herself filled with a sense of anticipation and joy. The neighborhood had changed so much in the past few months, and Edith felt more connected to her community than ever before. Rachel and the girls had invited Edith to spend Christmas with them in their new apartment, and Edith had gladly accepted. It was a far cry from the quiet, solitary holidays she had spent in years past, and she was looking forward to celebrating with people she cared about. On Christmas Eve, Edith arrived at Rachel's apartment with a basket full of gifts and homemade treats. The girls greeted her at the door, their faces bright with excitement, and Edith couldn't help but laugh as they pulled her inside. "We've been waiting for you," Lily exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with joy. Mom made hot chocolate. Edith's heart swelled with affection as she followed the girls into the cozy living room where Rachel was waiting with a warm smile. The apartment was decorated with twinkling lights and a small Christmas tree, and the air was filled with the comforting scent of cinnamon and pine. "Welcome, Edith," Rachel said, hugging her tightly. "We're so glad you're here." "I wouldn't want to be anywhere else," Edith replied, her voice full of warmth. As they sat together by the fire, sipping hot chocolate and exchanging stories, Edith felt a deep sense of contentment. This was what she had been missing for so long, a sense of connection, of belonging, of family. The evening passed in a blur of laughter, conversation, and warmth. The girls opened their presents with wide-eyed excitement, and Edith marveled at how far they had come since the dark days of living under Derek's control. They were happy, healthy, and full of life, and Edith knew that Rachel had done an incredible job of creating a safe, loving home for them. Later that night, after the girls had gone to bed, Rachel and Edith sat together by the fire, reflecting on everything that had happened over the past year. "It feels like a lifetime ago," Rachel said quietly, her eyes focused on the flickering flames. "Sometimes I still can't believe we made it out." "But we did." "You did," Edith corrected gently. "You found the strength to leave, and now you and the girls have a bright future ahead of you." Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Edith. You were there when I needed someone the most, and I'll never forget that." Edith reached out and took Rachel's hand, squeezing it gently. "We've been there for each other, and we'll keep being there, no matter what comes next." As they sat together in the quiet of the night, Edith felt a deep sense of peace settling over her. The storm was over, and now it was time to move forward to embrace the future with open arms, knowing that they had all found the strength to survive and thrive. And in that moment, Edith knew that everything would be all right. Thank you for following along with Edith's emotional and inspiring journey. If you found this story moving or relatable, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on more powerful stories like this. We'll be bringing you more heartwarming tales of resilience, community, and the strength of the human spirit. And don't forget to click the notification bell so you'll always be the first to know when new content is available. We value your feedback, so if you enjoyed this story, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being part of our storytelling community, and stay tuned for more stories that remind us all that no matter how hard things get, we are never truly alone.